Kamusta na ang lahat? Panibagong 15 items na naman ang gagawin natin for psychological assessment para sa ating review for board exam. And since ready ka na, simulan na natin. Psychological assessment review questions. Number 1. An experiment is said to be confounded when A. Undesirable variables are not kept out of the experiment. B. Undesirable variables are kept out of the experiment. C. Basic research is used in place of applied research. Or letter D. The sample is random. Number 2. In experimental terminology, IV stands for blank and DV stands for blank. A. Independent variable, dependent variable. B. Decent variable, indecent variable. C. Individual variable, dependent variable. D. Internal variable, designer variable. Number 3. A professor in psychology hypothesized that biofeedback training could reduce anxiety and improve the average scores on written board exam. If the professor decides to conduct a formal experiment, the IV will be the blank and the DV will be the blank. A. Professor, anxiety level. B. Anxiety level, board exam score. C. Biofeedback, board exam score. D. Board exam score, biofeedback. Number 4, experimenters should always abide by a code of ethics. The variable you manipulate or control in an experiment is the A. DV. B. Dependent variable. C. The variable you will measure to determine the outcome. Or letter D. IV or independent variable. Number 5, in order for the professor in psychology to conduct an experiment regarding his hypothesis, he will need A or an A. Biofeedback group, systematic desensitization group. B. Control group, systematic desensitization group. C. Control group, experimental group. D. At least 60 subjects in the control group and at least 60 subjects in the experimental group. Number 6. In order for the psychology professor to conduct the experiment, the experimental group would need to receive A. The manipulated IV. B. The biofeedback training. C. A and B. Or D. The organismic independent variable. 7. Hypothesis testing is most closely related to the work of A. Happock. B. Freud. C. Lloyd Morgan. D. R. A. Fisher. Number 8. The null hypothesis suggests that there will be or there will not be a significant difference between the experimental group which received the IV and the control group which did not. Thus, if the experiment was conducted, the null hypothesis would suggest that A. All students receive biofeedback training would score equally well on the board exam. B. Systematic desensitization might work better than biofeedback. C. Biofeedback will not improve the board exam scores. Or D. Meta-analysis is required. Number 9. The hunch is known as the experimental or alternative hypothesis. The experimental hypothesis suggests that a difference will be evident between the control group and experimental group, like the group receiving the IV. Thus, if the experiment in question 3 were conducted, letter A, the biofeedback would raise the board scores. B, the control group would score better on the board exam. C, there will be no difference between the experimental and control groups. Or D, the experiment has been confounded. Number 10, from a purely statistical standpoint, in order to compare a control group which does not receive the IV or experimental manipulation to the experimental group, the researcher will need A. A correlation coefficient, B. Only descriptive statistics, C. Percentile rank, or D. A test of significance. Number 11. When you see the letter P in relation to a test of significance, it means A. Portion, B. Population parameter, C. Probability, or D. The researcher is using an ethnographic qualitative approach. Number 12. In the social sciences, the accepted probability level is usually A. 0.05 or less, B. 1.0 or higher, C. 0.001 or less, or letter D. 5.0. Number 13. P equals 0.05 really means that A. 5 subjects were not included in the study. B. There's only a 5% chance that the difference between the control group and the experimental groups is due to the chance factor. C. The level of significance is 0.01. Or letter D. No level of significance has been set. Number 14. P is equals to 0.05 really means that A. Differences truly exist. The experimenter will obtain the same result 95% out of 100 times. B. Differences truly exist. The experimenter will obtain the same results 99 out of 100 times. Or letter C. There is a 95% error factor. Or D. There is 10% error factor. And last, number 15, the study would be best rule out chance factors would have a significance level of P is equals to A. 0.05, B. 0.01, C. 0.001, or letter D. 0.08. And let's now proceed to answers and explanation. Number 1. An experiment is said to be confounded when, and the answer is letter A. Undesirable variables are not kept out of the experiment. Confounding is said to occur when an undesirable variable which is not controlled by the researcher is introduced in the experiment. Also, it also referred to as contaminating variable. Basic research is conducted to advance our understanding of theory, while applied research, also known as action research or experience near research, is conducted to advance our knowledge on how theories, skills, and techniques can be used in terms of practical application. Number 2. In experimental terminology, IB stands for blank and DB stands for blank. And the answer is letter A. Variables in an experiment are categorized as independent variable or IV or dependent variable or DV. A variable is merely a behavior or circumstance that can exist on at least two levels or condition. In the experiment, the IV is the variable that the researcher manipulates, controls, alters, or wishes to experiment with. Number 3. A professor in psychology hypothesized that biofeedback training could reduce anxiety and improve the average score on written board exam. If the professor decides to conduct a formal experiment, the IV will be the blank and the DB will be the blank. And the answer is letter C, biofeedback board exam score. The I statement here gives you the IV. For your DB, remember DB with letter D like data. Your data is provided by the board exam score. True, the researcher hypothesized that the training lowers anxiety, but you won't have any direct data regarding this trait. Hence, it will not be your DV in this experiment. Number 4, experimenters should always abide by a code of ethics. The variable you manipulate or control in an experiment is and the answer is letter D, independent variable. In any experiment, the researcher is guided by ethics. This suggests first that subjects are informed of any risk. Second, the negative after effects are removed. Third, that you will allow subject to withdraw at any time. Fourth, that confidentiality of subjects will be protected. Fifth, that research reports will be presented in an accurate format that is not misleading. Six, that you will use only techniques that you are trained in. Research is considered a necessary factor in the profession. Number 5, in order for professor in psychology to conduct an experiment regarding his hypothesis, he will need A or an, and the answer is letter C, control group, experimental group. The control group and the experimental group both have the same characteristic, except that members of the control group will not have the experimental treatment applied to them. The control group does not receive the independent variable. The experimental group receives the IV, or independent variable. The basic presupposition is that the average or means of the group do not differ significantly at the beginning of the experiment. Number 6, in order for the psychology professor to conduct experiment, the experimental group would need to receive, and the answer is letter C, A and B. The experimental group receives the IV, which is in this case the biofeedback training. An organismic variable is one the researcher cannot control, yet it exists, such as height, weight, or gender. To determine whether an organismic independent variable exists, you simply ask yourself if there is an experimental variable being examined which you cannot manipulate. In most cases, when you are confronted with IV-DB identification questions, the IB will be of the manipulated variety. Number 7, hypothesis testing is mostly closely related to the work of, and the answer is letter D, Fisher. Hypothesis testing was pioneered by R.A. Fisher. A hypothesis is a hunch or an educated guess which can be tested utilizing the experimental model. A hypothesis might be that biofeedback raises board exam scores, or that reality therapy reduces dysfunctional classroom behavior in high school, or perhaps that cognitive therapy relieves depression in males in the midst of pandemic. A hypothesis is a statement which can be tested regarding the relationship of the IV and the DV. 8. The null hypothesis suggests that there will be no significant difference between experimental group. And the answer is letter C. Biofeedback will not improve the board exam scores. The null hypothesis asserts that the sample will not change even after the experimental variable is applied. The null hypothesis states that the control group and the experimental will not differ at the end of the experiment. The null hypothesis is simply that the IV does not affect the DB. Null means nil or nothing. Null is a statement of no difference. Number 9, a hunch is known as the experimental or alternative hypothesis. And the answer is letter A. The biofeedback would raise the board scores. An alternative hypothesis, which may be called the affirmative hypothesis on your exam, asserts that the IV has indeed caused a change. Number 10, from a purely statistical standpoint, In order to compare control group to the experimental group, the researcher will need, and the answer is letter D, a test of significance. Choice A, or correlation research, does not make use of the paradigm in which an IV is experimentally introduced. Descriptive statistics, or choice B, as the name implies, merely describes the data. In order to compare two groups, inferential statistics, which infers something about the population, are necessary. Number 11. When you see the letter P in relation to a test of significance, it means, and the answer is letter C, probability. A parameter is technically a value obtained from a population, while statistics is a value drawn from a sample. A parameter summarizes a characteristic of population. The correct answer is choice C, which refers to the probability or the level of significance. Traditionally, the probability in social science research, often indicated by P, has been set at 0.05. The 0.05 level indicates that differences would occur by a chance only 5 times in 100. Number 12, in the social science, the accepted probability level is usually, and the answer is letter A. 0.05 and 0.01 are the two most popular level of significance in social science research. Number 13, P is equals to 0.5 really means that, and the answer is letter B. Many experts in the field feels that it is misleading when many exams still refer to this as the 95% confidence interval, meaning that the result would be due to chance only 5 times out of 100. When P is equals to 0.05, differences in the experimental group and control group are evident at the end of the experiment, and the odds are only 1 in 20. That is, can be explained by chance. So, once more, for good measure, your exam could refer to the level of significance as the level of confidence, or simply the confidence level. The meaning is intended to be the same. Number 14. P is equals to 0.05 really means that, and the answer is letter A. Number 15. The study that would best rule out chance factors would have a significant level of P, and the answer is letter C. The smaller the value for the P, the more stringent the level of significance. Here, the 0.001 level is the most stringent level listed, indicating that there is only one chance in 1,000 that the results are due to chance, versus 20 for 0.05, and the 1 in 100 for 0.01. In plain English, it is easier to get significant result using 0.08, 0.05, 0.01 than it is using 0.001. At natapos muli tayo sa ating drill. I hope nag-enjoy ka sa ginawa nating exercise. Anong score mo? Paki-type in mo naman. And don't forget to click subscribe and hit the notification bell para lagi kang nare-remind na meron pa tayong review. Don't forget to keep safe and have a nice day.